what is going on in Zimbabwe, particularly pertaining to the issue of the compensation of white farmers for the improvements on the farms that were taken over by the government during the land redistribution program. Allow me to take you back in history, back to 1980. The treaty that was signed in order for the War of Liberation to end is called the Lancaster Agreement because it was signed in Lancaster in the UK. The Lancaster Agreement, when it came to the issue of the land, it clearly stated that from 1980 to 1990, the government of Zimbabwe would not discuss land redistribution. But beginning in 1990, the government will implement the land redistribution program. And when implemented, the compensation to the white farmers for the land was going to be made by Britain. Under no circumstances was Zimbabwe going to compensate the white farmers for the land. That was made very clear, and it remains the case today. The government of Zimbabwe, however, was responsible for compensating the farmers for the improvements on the land. That is, for any houses that may be on the land, for any irrigation systems, any dams that may be on the land. The Constitution said the government of Zimbabwe must compensate the farmers.
I'm going to have to say that I'm sorry, Mama Chihombori, we can no longer continue to have your generation asking us as Africans to always compromise for the benefit of Europeans. We can no longer continue to have your generation telling our generation that you're going to make compromises for the sake of reconciliation with people that we know are never going to reconcile with us. We cannot continue to have you talk about compromises that only see Africans giving to the European and the European never giving back to the African. I must remind you, Mama Chihombori, that as you said, the Lancaster House Conference was first of all negotiated under duress. It was negotiated under duress when Mozambique, Tanzania, and Zambia were threatened by the United States, Kissinger, and the British to say force the liberation fighters of Zimbabwe to come to the negotiating table. They also told them to tell the liberation fighters that if they did not accept the conditions of the Lancaster House Conference, they will no longer have training bases, they will no longer have bases to launch the war in Rhodesia. So under duress, the Lancaster House Conference was negotiated. Under duress, the Lancaster House said that we cannot take land for at least 10 years. And it is not true that land reform was not discussed in the first 10 years. It was discussed, but it was willing buyer, willing seller, in which our government, in the name of reconciliation, had to pay white farmers in foreign currency for land that they did not want. And they had to pay this foreign currency up front, and then the British would match whatever that our government had paid. And up till 1990, this government was paying for land. Not only was it paying for land, the Lancaster House Agreement under duress again also said that our government would have to pay the debts of the Rhodesian government, debts that were used to buy weapons to fight our parents and to stop them from getting independence, debts that were used to prop up the Rhodesian government at a time where people were starving in Zimbabwe. Those debts were brought onto Zimbabwe, and in the name of reconciliation, $700 to $800 million of debts taken illegally under sanctions of the UN had to be paid by Zimbabwe, and these were high interest rate debts that had to be paid by 1987. We paid those. The IMF, together with the West, had their banks continue to insist that for us to have a credit rating, we had to pay these loans, and if we didn't have the money, we had to take new loans to pay off these Rhodesian debts. Debts were taken to pay off debt. And when we couldn't pay the debt that was taken to pay off Rhodesian debt, we had to take more debt. That led us into ISAP. The ISAP that made sure that the IMF and the World Bank gave us conditions that destroyed our industry, devalued our dollars, destroyed our leather industry, destroyed our motor industry, and the industry that manufactured TVs and electronics in Zimbabwe was destroyed by these IMF conditions. Black farmers were not allowed to be subsidized, and the only farmers that had to be subsidized in Zimbabwe were white farmers for growing commercial crops to pay off the debts that the IMF had given us.
I may disagree with that aspect of the Constitution, but let's be fair. It's in the Constitution. It has been in the Constitution since 1990 that the farmers would be compensated for the improvements on the land.
Then this argument of saying that everything that is in the Constitution is right, you forget that the apartheid Constitution in South Africa said that apartheid was correct. You forget that slavery was in the American Constitution, the British Constitution. Colonialism was in all European nations' constitutions, but that didn't make it right. So the argument that this is in our Constitution and that it makes it right does not make it right if it's contrary to human rights, which should look at compensation, restitution, and reparations for those that have been oppressed. If it's contrary to international law, if it's contrary to the Jews getting compensation from the Germans, it cannot make sense for you then to be supporting the compensation of white farmers, because the Jews never compensated the Nazis. The French never compensated the Nazis. Europe did not compensate the Nazis. So it cannot make sense, my Chihombori, for you to be supporting a PR position of a government that is standing on the wrong side of history. Then let me tell you what is the biggest problem. You stand here talking about Pan-Africanism. You stand here about bringing humanity and dignity to black people, but you are supporting the compensation of white people at the expense of black people that never got reparations, forgetting that you're creating an international precedent. An international precedent that's going to make it very difficult for any black people across the world, any oppressed people across the world, any dispossessed people across the world to get anything that was taken from them by force compensated. You're making it difficult for the Aboriginal to take back his land from the Australian that took his land by violence without compensating for each and every development that was built by a colonizer on his land. You're making it difficult for American Indians to take back their land from the colony of the United States without compensating the hundreds of trillions of dollars of property that was developed with their resources and their labor. That is an injustice, that is a travesty, and this PR exercise that your generation carry out for imperialism to continue on the African continent is unacceptable.
Be it as it may, in the spirit of reconciliation, in the spirit of coming together as children of one Zimbabwe, regardless of your skin color, the government has agreed to this 3.5 billion figure. Now, one might argue that why are they being compensated while the blacks, when the land was taken, they were not compensated? I tell you what, we gotta move forward. We want the sanctions lifted. If this was a tiebreaker for getting the sanctions lifted, let it be.
And then finally, what it is that the Zimbabwean government is doing is creating a precedent that says that white people are the only people who can produce. Because now they're going to be given $3 billion in a country where they're going to use that money to start farming, and they're going to successfully farm when black farmers were never given that amount of money or compensation by the government of Zimbabwe. Then they're going to say black people cannot farm because of people like you who support nonsense in terms of international precedents. You are going to create the impression that we as Africans need to be looked after by white people because of this nonsense PR position that you're taking. How is South Africa going to take back their land? They must compensate or 100 billion to Boer farmers? This is a travesty of justice, and people like you who are paid to speak for us as Africans make me angry. And you people, your generation, need to step aside for young people to start taking over.